London held its breath in the hour after midnight. It did not feel like sleep, not truly, but a softer kind of attention, as if the city had decided to listen to itself for a while. The fog was everywhere, patient and unhurried. It pooled at the curbs, curled around the iron railings, and floated in pale layers beneath the lamps. Each gaslight wore a halo that seemed larger than the lamp itself, a luminous bruise against the dark. The pavement shone with damp, not slick but quietly reflective, as though it kept small memories of each passing footstep. In that gentled world, sound did not travel far. A distant door closed with a muted firmness. A taxi's engine sighed somewhere beyond the curtain of mist. And then even that faded, leaving only the slow, steady hum of the city's heart. Eleanor Hart stepped out of St. Bartholomew's side entrance with the careful steadiness of someone who had been standing for too long. Her cape sat heavy on her shoulders. The strap of her bag pressed a familiar line into her glove. She paused on the stone threshold, as if it were the edge of a different country, and for a moment, she simply let the air reach her. It was cold, though not sharp. It felt more like clean water than a knife. The chill found the places where her uniform had warmed her skin, and she noticed, with mild surprise, that her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, not from urgency, but from the slow release of duty. In the hospital, there had always been a bell, a call, a clatter of wheels, an instruction that needed obeying. Out here, the night asked nothing of her. It only surrounded her, softly and completely. Behind her, the building's windows glowed. The light did not look golden from this angle. It looked white and practical, like folded sheets. Eleanor could still feel the shift in her bones, as if she had carried it out with her, hours measured in breath counts and whispered reassurances, in the rustle of charts, in the careful turning of bodies that had become too tired to turn themselves. She had bathed foreheads. She had adjusted blankets. She had watched a patient's fingers loosen around a cup and had gently tightened her own grip in response, as if steadiness could be passed from hand to hand. She had done all of it with a quiet competence that came from repetition. She had done it without thinking of herself, because thinking of herself had felt like a luxury, and she had grown skilled at living without luxuries. The fog made the street lamp outside the hospital entrance look like a small moon pinned low. Eleanor's shoes found the first puddle and made almost no sound. She walked toward the corner where Nightingale Street met a wider road, her steps measured, not hurried. Even her exhaustion moved politely, as if it did not wish to disturb the night. The street names in this part of London always made her think of the hospital's long tradition, of the stories that floated in training wards like unseen ribbon: Nightingale, Florence, Lamplight, clean hands, the quiet heroism of ordinary care. Eleanor had once found those words stirring. Now they felt like an old hymn, still true, still steady, but sung too often to make the chest rise the way it once did. She passed shuttered shops and a bakery that would not wake for several hours yet. In one upstairs window, a narrow band of light showed through a gap in the curtains, as if someone had fallen asleep mid-thought. The thought made Eleanor's mouth soften into the smallest hint of a smile. People were still living inside these buildings. They were still doing their own private endurance. It steadied her, the reminder that the world did not belong solely to the hospital. She had been spending so many nights under fluorescent glare that she sometimes forgot there were other kinds of light. At the bus stop, the timetable stood behind glass. The printed letters were slightly blurred by moisture, and Eleanor leaned closer to read them. The last service, a route that crossed the city like a calm line drawn through sleep. She stood with her hands folded at her waist, posture taught by training, and watched the fog drift past. The bench was damp. The metal pole of the stop was cold enough to sting through her gloves. Still, there was comfort in the simple fact that she was waiting for something that would come, an object in the future that required no more than patience. The idea felt almost magical, though she would not have named it so. At the hospital, waiting was often a painful thing, a restless thing. Here, waiting could be quiet, waiting. A man in a bowler hat appeared out of the fog as if he had been drawn forward by the lamp's pale circle. He stood a respectful distance away and adjusted his collar. Eleanor glanced at him and then back to the road, not because she feared him, but because the night encouraged a certain privacy. A second figure arrived, a woman holding a small bundle of newspapers under her arm. She shook her hands once, briskly, as if shaking off the cold, and then settled into stillness. None of them spoke. The silence did not feel awkward. It felt agreed upon, like a shared blanket. Eleanor listened to the quiet and found that her thoughts did not race the way they sometimes did after a long shift. They drifted, they floated. Images from the ward came and went like shapes behind thin curtains. The white arch of a sheet, the blue shadow under a patient's eyes, the way the clock hands had seemed to circle without moving forward. She was not thinking in sentences, she was thinking in sensations, the smell of carbolic, the faint sting of soap, the weight of a stethoscope around a doctor's neck, the soft gasp of a kettle in the staff room, and beneath it all, a tiredness so complete it felt like a second coat. She shifted her bag from one hand to the other and noticed with a strange clarity that her fingers ached. They had been working all evening, fastening, unfastening, lifting, lowering, smoothing, writing. Hands were the nurse's instruments. Eleanor had taken pride in her steadiness, in her ability to make even a difficult procedure feel calm by the way she held a wrist, by the way she spoke. Yet the ache in her fingers was a quiet truth. Her body had been giving more than it could comfortably give, and still it had kept going. There was dignity in that, she thought, though the thought did not arrive like a proclamation. It came like a warm word spoken near the ear. Somewhere down the road, a low engine sound began. It was not loud. It was more like a steady purr that grew slowly, as if the vehicle were making its way through the fog with patience rather than force. The man in the bowler hat leaned forward a fraction. The woman with newspapers lifted her chin. Eleanor felt her own attention gather. The bus emerged gradually, its headlights forming twin circles of light that seemed to push the mist aside. The front sign was readable only when it was close enough to be real. For a moment, it looked like a floating rectangle, a ghost of a destination. Then it became a bus with a name and a number, a promise made of metal and wood and warmth. It drew up with a soft hiss, doors folding open like a careful breath. Warm air spilled out. It carried the scent of wool coats, old upholstery, and a faint trace of tobacco that seemed embedded in the fabric of London itself. Eleanor stepped forward with the others. She climbed the first step and felt the difference immediately, as if she had stepped from winter into a room where someone had been keeping a fire. The interior light was dim, not harsh. It was a gentle amber that softened faces and made the brass rails glow. The seats were worn but welcoming, each one holding the impression of countless bodies that had sat and let themselves be carried. The conductor stood near the entrance, small and neat, his uniform tidy in a way that suggested careful habits. His face had the kind of mild patience Eleanor recognized from senior nurses, people who had learned how to keep their own center, no matter what the night delivered. He held out his ticket machine. The sound of it clicking, of its metal mouth opening and closing, was oddly comforting. It was a simple rhythm, as steady as a metronome. Eleanor reached for her coins. Her gloves made the movement clumsy. She removed one glove and felt the cold air bite her fingertips before the warmth inside the bus quickly soothed them again. "Fare, miss," the conductor said, not sharply, not curtly, just plainly, as if speaking the simplest truth in the world. Eleanor paid and received her small paper ticket. She tucked it into her bag without looking at it, then hesitated. It was such a small thing to possess. Proof of passage, proof that she had a place to be. She realized, in a quiet way, that she had not carried much proof of herself lately. The hospital had required her presence, but it did not record her as a person. It recorded her actions, her signatures on forms, her notes in charts, her steps in corridors. A ticket felt like a token that belonged to Eleanor Hart alone. She moved down the aisle. The bus was not full, but it was not empty either. A few passengers sat with their coats buttoned up and their heads slightly bowed, as if resting in the space between destinations. One elderly man stared at the window as if reading the fog. A young woman held a handbag tightly, not out of fear, but out of habit. Someone's breath made a small cloud before it dissolved into warmth. Eleanor chose a seat near the middle, where she could see both the driver's steady shoulders and the dim life of the bus behind her. She sat down and felt the seat cushion accept her weight with a slow surrender, like a mattress settling under a weary body. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass. It turned the world into soft shapes and muffled distance. Eleanor watched London slide by in muted tones. Street lamps passed like slow stars. A row of terraced houses appeared and vanished. A telephone box glowed faintly, its red barely visible through the mist, like a sleeping ember. The bus moved with a calm certainty, and Eleanor's body, which had been held tense by responsibility for so long, began to loosen without her permission. Her shoulders dropped, her hands unclenched. She leaned back and let the warmth seep into her bones. For the first time in hours, she felt something close to safety. Not safety from danger exactly, but safety from demand. The bus did not ask her to be quick. It did not ask her to be capable. It only asked her to sit. It carried her the way a river carries a leaf, the way a lullaby carries a child toward sleep. Eleanor's eyes lingered on the fog and the lamplight beyond it, and she had the distinct sense that this ride, though ordinary, might hold something more than a route across London. It might hold a kind of kindness. It might, in its quiet way, remember her. As the bus turned a corner and the lamp halos shifted across the wet glass, Eleanor let her gaze drift along the aisle. Faces remained mostly turned inward, each passenger wrapped in their own hush. Yet there was a shared atmosphere, a gentle awareness of being together in this moving pocket of warmth. Eleanor felt the smallest lift in her chest, like the beginning of a breath she had forgotten she could take. She did not need anything grand. She did not need rescue. She only needed this, a place to rest for a little while, and the faint possibility that, somewhere along the fog-bound road, she might be seen as more than her exhaustion. The bus rocked onward with a steady, deliberate sway, as if it had learned long ago that the night preferred gentleness to speed. Eleanor sat with her hands folded over her bag, feeling the warmth rise through the layers of her cape and uniform. The interior smelled of damp wool and polished wood, and beneath it all, there was a faint medicinal note that might have been carried in on her own clothes, a ghost of carbolic that clung to the edges of her world. She watched her reflection in the window for a moment, pale and softened by mist, and found it difficult to decide whether she looked young or old. Under hospital lights, she had always appeared brisk, defined by purpose, but here the dim amber bulbs made her face look quieter, as if it belonged to someone who could be allowed to simply exist. The conductor moved down the aisle in unhurried steps. His ticket machine sat in his hand like a small instrument, familiar and precise. Each time he stopped beside a passenger, he bent slightly, listened, and performed his small exchange with care. Coins appeared, paper tickets were offered. The machine clicked and punched, producing neat holes that felt oddly ceremonial in the hush. The sound repeated at intervals: click, press, release, and with each repetition, the bus seemed to settle deeper into its role as a moving refuge. Eleanor thought of the hospital's sounds, so sharp and sudden: bells, trolleys, hurried footsteps, the crisp snap of a sheet being pulled taut. This click was different. It was the sound of order without urgency, of routine without cruelty. When the conductor reached Eleanor's row again, perhaps to check that she had been given the correct fare, perhaps simply because he was thorough, she lifted her eyes. He looked at her ticket as if it mattered, as if it were not merely a scrap of paper, but a document of belonging. His fingers took it lightly, and for a second, Eleanor's gaze dropped to his hands. They were clean and steady, the nails trimmed, the skin slightly reddened by winter. Working hands, but not frantic hands. They reminded her of the hands of a ward sister who could calm a whole room simply by entering it. "All right, miss?" he asked in a tone that carried no expectation of a particular answer. Eleanor found herself nodding, though the word "all right" felt too simple for the state of her body. Still, she could not deny that sitting here, being carried through fog, was the closest she had felt to all right in days. The conductor punched her ticket with a firm, practiced motion. The tiny holes appeared, clean and final, and then he handed it back. It should have been nothing. It should have been purely functional. Yet the act landed in Eleanor's mind like a gentle stamp of recognition. You are here. You are accounted for. You are permitted to be on your way. She tucked the ticket into her glove this time, not her bag, and let the paper rest against her palm. The sensation of it, thin, slightly rough, warmed by her skin, was unexpectedly grounding. A nurse's hands were often full of other people's needs: cups, bandages, thermometers, linens, charts. Here her hand held only her own small proof of passage. The thought did not make her sad. It made her quiet. It made her aware of the difference between being needed and being seen. Outside, London continued to drift by in softened fragments. The bus's windows were fogged along the edges, leaving a clear oval in the center where breath and warmth had not yet claimed the glass. Through that clear space, Eleanor watched the lamplight spill on the street, making every wet cobblestone look like a polished pebble. A row of plane trees stood along the road, their branches bare and fine as ink strokes. The fog threaded between them like lace. Occasionally the bus passed a corner shop with its sign dimmed, or a pub with curtains drawn, its doorway dark as a closed eye. The city did not feel empty. It felt tucked in. Eleanor's gaze wandered down the aisle. The passengers were not numerous, but each one seemed to carry a whole world in the way they sat. Across from her, the man in the bowler hat had settled into a seat and now stared at his own hands, as if memorizing them. A few rows ahead, a couple sat close without touching, their shoulders nearly meeting, their heads tipped slightly toward the same window. Near the back, someone had leaned their forehead against the glass, and the warmth of their skin had made a small, clear circle in the misted pane. like a porthole into the night. There was no chatter, no jostling, no impatience. The bus felt like a room where voices had been respectfully set aside, and yet, Eleanor sensed conversation everywhere, not in words, but in the simple fact of shared presence. In the hospital, she had often felt surrounded by people, and yet alone, because each interaction demanded something: a request, a response, a decision. Here, no one demanded. They simply rode. That simplicity created space for a softer kind of awareness. Eleanor realized she could notice the curve of someone's collar, the careful folding of a scarf, the quiet way a stranger breathed. The details did not ask anything of her. They just existed. It was restful to witness without needing to act. The bus turned, and its motion drew a gentle sway through the passengers, a shared rocking like a cradle's rhythm. Eleanor's eyelids grew heavier. She did not quite sleep, but she slipped into a state where thoughts became slower and less sharp. She remembered being a girl in Sussex, half asleep on a train bench while her mother's hand rested on her shoulder. She remembered the sound of wheels on tracks, the steady repetition that made time feel kind. The memory was not dramatic. It was small, warm, and oddly bright against her fatigue. Her mind drifted back to the hospital. But the memories arrived differently now. They were not urgent images demanding reaction. They were like photographs held at arm's length. She saw herself moving through a ward at dusk, her shoes squeaking faintly on the linoleum. She saw the way she had smiled at a patient to hide her own weariness. She saw the moment she had swallowed back irritation when a young doctor had spoken over her, as if her experience were a piece of furniture rather than a living thing. These memories did not sting sharply. They carried a dull ache, the ache of being essential and invisible at the same time. Eleanor shifted her shoulders and let her cape fall more comfortably around her. Her bag rested against her knee like a quiet companion. She thought of the women she worked with, their faces lined by night duty and lit by small humor, their competence taken for granted. She thought of herself as one among many, and the thought should have made her feel ordinary in a diminishing way, but instead, it made her feel part of something steady. Ordinary endurance, the sort that did not make headlines, the sort that held the world together. She had never wanted applause. She had only wanted sometimes to feel that her personhood existed alongside her usefulness. The bus slowed as it approached a stop, and the brakes sighed softly, like a restrained exhale. The doors opened with a gentle clatter. Cold air reached in, and the passengers' coats seemed to tighten in response. A woman stepped aboard, her cheeks pink from the chill. She carried a small cloth bag and smelled faintly of soap and starch. The conductor greeted her with the same calm attention he had offered everyone. He took her coins, punched her ticket, and handed it back as if handing her a key. Eleanor watched the exchange and felt again the strange tenderness of that sound. The ticket punch, clean and final. She had spent hours making marks on charts, writing observations, circling numbers, documenting life in ink. Those marks were for the hospital. They served a purpose, but they did not feel personal. This punched ticket was for the traveler. It said, "You have a place on this route. You are expected. You are allowed to be carried." The newly arrived woman moved down the aisle and sat 2 rows ahead of Eleanor. She sighed once, a long sound of relief, and then sat still. Eleanor recognized the sigh. It was the same sound she sometimes made when she finally sat down in the staff room after hours of standing. It was not a complaint. It was a letting go. Hearing it from a stranger made Eleanor feel less alone with her own fatigue. It was as if the bus had gathered a handful of tired souls and offered them without ceremony, a shared bowl of quiet. As the bus resumed its motion, the conductor returned toward the front. His footsteps were soft, his posture straight, without stiffness. Eleanor imagined his life in small glimpses: the early start, the familiar routes, the steady responsibility of getting people home. It was work that could disappear into routine. Yet, he performed it as if it mattered. In the hospital, Eleanor had known men who treated routine as an excuse for carelessness, as if repeated tasks were beneath attention. This conductor did the opposite. His steadiness felt like a kind of respect for the ordinary. Eleanor looked down at her ticket again, held between her gloved fingers. The punched holes formed a small pattern, plain and unadorned. She traced them lightly, feeling the tiny edges. The paper was warm now. She could imagine, absurdly, that it carried a little of the bus's safety in it, a portable proof that the night had held her gently for a time. She allowed herself to rest her head against the seat back and listen to the bus's hum, to the soft rattle of windows, to the faint creak of the floorboards as the vehicle moved. The rhythm was consistent. It did not rush. It did not hesitate. It simply continued. And as the bus carried her deeper into fog-softened London, Eleanor began to understand that this ride was not merely transport. It was a pause between demands. It was a corridor made of warmth and lamplight, where a weary nurse could remember, in quiet increments, that she was not only a set of competent hands, she was a whole person, riding through the night like anyone else, holding a small punched ticket like a modest blessing, and letting herself be carried toward whatever morning would be. The route the bus followed seemed older than Eleanor's weariness, as if the streets themselves had been laid out long ago for the comfort of those who needed to cross the city quietly. It moved with measured confidence, turning corners without surprise, climbing gentle slopes as if the effort were natural. The fog thickened in places and thinned in others, and Eleanor began to feel as though London was being revealed to her not all at once, but in careful scenes, arranged by lamplight. The gas lamps stood like patient sentries along the road. Each one held a soft aureole that hovered in the mist, and together they formed a slow constellation, a private sky set low for night travelers. When the bus passed beneath a lamp, the light swept across the windows and the passengers' faces, turning them briefly luminous before returning them to shadow. The effect was strangely theatrical, as if the city had become a quiet stage, and the bus was the only audience permitted to watch. Eleanor leaned slightly toward the window, drawn to the way the fog softened every edge. In daylight, London could appear hard with its angles and its soot, its brick and iron, its hurried crowds. Tonight, the mist made everything gentler. A row of buildings looked like a charcoal drawing left unfinished. A church spire emerged for a moment and then faded again, like a thought that could not quite be held. Even the street signs seemed less firm, their letters blurred by damp and distance. Eleanor found comfort in the softened outlines. It reminded her of how certain ward lights could be dimmed at night to calm patients, how a harsh room could become kind simply by lowering the glare. The city, it seemed, was doing something similar for its own tired souls. The bus's interior became a moving pocket of warmth against that pale darkness. The windows held the passengers' breath in faint ghosts that formed and vanished, and the air inside carried the faint mineral scent of wet coats slowly drying. Eleanor's cape, once heavy with cold, had begun to warm through. She could feel the tight ache behind her eyes easing a fraction. It was not relief exactly, because relief suggested a problem solved, and Eleanor did not expect her exhaustion to be solved by a bus ride. It was more like permission, the permission to be still, the permission to let the night do some of the holding. She watched as they passed a small square, its trees bare and reaching upward like open hands. The fog gathered around the branches and made them look like lace. A bench sat empty beneath a lamp, and the light falling on it seemed to wait patiently, as if it would keep shining whether someone arrived or not. That simple persistence of light struck Eleanor as both ordinary and quietly miraculous. At the hospital, light meant duty. It meant staying awake, watching, measuring. Here, light meant guidance. It meant safety for strangers. It was the same element, used differently, and the difference mattered. As the bus rolled on, Eleanor's thoughts began to arrange themselves into a softer pattern. She noticed how the city outside, muffled by fog, allowed her mind to move more gently, as if her own thoughts were also being softened at the edges. She remembered, without sharpness, a moment from earlier in the evening when she had stood beside a patient's bed and adjusted a pillow. The patient had been an elderly woman with thin silver hair and a gaze that wandered, and when Eleanor had leaned close, the woman's hand had reached up and rested briefly on Eleanor's wrist. It had been a small gesture, not demanding, not dramatic, yet Eleanor had felt in that touch a kind of recognition. Not gratitude in the grand sense, but awareness. You are there. You are a person, too. In the rush of the ward, Eleanor had barely registered it. Now, in the bus's warm hush, the memory returned with quiet weight. She glanced down the aisle again. The passengers sat in their own private pockets of thought, yet the bus's shared rhythm made them feel connected, like beads on the same string. Eleanor saw the slight rise and fall of shoulders with breath, the slow blink of someone fighting sleep, the careful way a woman adjusted her scarf as if tucking herself in. The conductor had moved back toward the front, his presence still felt even when he was not in view. The driver's silhouette remained steady, hands calm on the wheel. Everything about the bus suggested continuity. It was not a place for suddenness. It was a place that moved forward evenly and without fuss. Outside, the fog became thicker again, and the world narrowed to what the headlights could reach. The beams cut two pale tunnels through the mist. Within those tunnels, Eleanor could see the road markings slide toward them and then disappear beneath the bus. It was hypnotic, that slow approach and vanishing. She realized she was watching the city in the same way she watched a patient's breathing at night, a repeated pattern that reassured her simply by continuing. In the ward, when breathing faltered, everyone's body tightened. Here, the steady road and the steady light made her loosen. She was not on vigilance. She was on passage. A quiet change came over her in that awareness. She began to see the bus not only as transport, but as a kind of threshold. The hospital had its own world, sealed by routine and urgency. The city had another, sealed by daylight and expectation. This bus moved between them in the deepest hours, when neither world was fully awake. It existed in an in-between realm where a person could be neither nurse nor worker nor caretaker, but simply a traveler. Eleanor had not realized how much she needed that. She had been wearing her role like a second skin for so long that she had almost forgotten the sensation of being unobserved, unmeasured, and free from immediate responsibility. The bus passed beneath a railway bridge, and the darkness under it felt momentarily complete, as if even the fog had held its breath. Then they emerged again into lamplight, and Eleanor saw a few flakes of frost on the edges of the pavement, glittering faintly like sugar. The sight was so small and so beautiful that it made her chest tighten gently. In the hospital, she saw bodies every day, saw pain and fatigue and resilience, yet she rarely saw frost sparkle. The world, she realized, had been continuing to offer quiet beauty while she had been inside, giving her attention to what was necessary. Beauty had not demanded anything. It had simply waited. A soft creak came from the back of the bus as someone shifted position. The sound was not startling. It felt like a page turning in a book. Eleanor listened to the bus as if it were telling a story in its own slow language. The hum of the engine, the whisper of tires on wet road, the occasional mild rattle of a window. Each sound was steady, predictable, and therefore soothing. The bus did not announce itself loudly. It did not insist. It moved the way an experienced nurse moved through a sleeping ward, careful not to disturb. Eleanor's eyes grew heavier again. She let them close for a moment and found herself sinking into an almost dream. In that half state, she saw the hospital corridor stretching long, lined with doors, each one holding a patient and a private world. She saw herself walking down that corridor carrying a tray, and as she walked, the corridor began to widen, to soften, to fill with fog. The doors became less like doors and more like curtains. The corridor became a street. The tray became her bag. The dream was not frightening. It was gentle in its transformation, as if her mind were trying to tell her that she could walk out of one world and into another without breaking. She opened her eyes and found the bus still moving, still steady, the fog still pressing softly at the windows. The lamps outside continued their slow procession. Eleanor watched them as if counting stars. Each one appeared, brightened as they drew near, then slid away behind them. The repetition was calming, like a rosary of light. She wondered how many nights these lamps had watched over tired people, factory workers, late shift clerks, mothers returning from helping a newborn grandchild, men coming home from pubs, women carrying groceries before dawn. Each of them had likely felt some version of what she felt now, weariness, yes, but also the quiet dignity of making it through. There was something almost sacred about that shared endurance, even if no one ever spoke of it. A faint pressure formed behind Eleanor's sternum, not painful, just present. She recognized it as emotion, though it did not have a dramatic shape. It was not grief, not joy, not even clear sadness. It was the tender ache of being tired and still continuing. It was the ache of having spent so long being useful that she had forgotten her own right to be cared for. In the hospital, she cared for strangers, and they sometimes looked at her with pleading eyes, as if she were a source of comfort beyond her own human limits. Eleanor had learned to accept that gaze without absorbing it. Yet there were moments, like tonight, when she realized that she too needed someone to look at her and see a person, not only a role. The fog outside made the city feel distant, and in that distance, Eleanor felt safer to think these thoughts. If she had been in the staff room under bright light, she might have dismissed them as self-indulgence. But the night bus, rocking gently through mist, seemed to grant her a softer interpretation of herself. It suggested that noticing one's own weariness was not weakness. It was truth. And truth, held gently, could be dignified. The bus approached another stop. The driver eased it down with care, and the doors opened with their familiar breath. A couple of passengers shifted, preparing to leave. Eleanor watched them stand and steady themselves, their movements slow. One man stepped down into the fog and was swallowed almost instantly by the mist, as if the city had folded him back into itself. The sight should have felt lonely, but instead it felt natural. People came and went. The bus continued. The night continued. Endurance did not need applause. It only needed room to happen. When the doors closed, and the bus resumed its motion, Eleanor felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This ride was doing something subtle to her, like warm water easing stiff joints. It was reminding her that she existed beyond the hospital walls, that she had a life in which she was not always moving toward someone else's need. The fog outside remained thick and pale. The lamps continued their slow, star-like passing, and Eleanor sat in the warm hush of the bus, letting the city's softened outlines tell her, without words, that being seen, even by oneself, mattered. The bus moved into a quieter district where the streets felt narrower and the buildings leaned closer together, as if the city were drawing its coat tighter against the cold. The lamps here seemed fewer, their halos wider in the fog, so that each pool of light looked like a small room set down on the pavement. Within those rooms, the bus passed slowly, and Eleanor had the gentle impression of entering and leaving chambers of brightness. The passengers remained mostly still, but the hush was not empty. It was full of small human sounds, the soft clearing of a throat, the faint rustle of fabric, the steady breathing of someone half asleep. Eleanor's own breath had found the bus's rhythm. She inhaled and exhaled without effort, as if her body remembered how to rest when it was finally allowed. 2 rows ahead, the woman who had boarded earlier shifted her bag onto her lap and began to work with her hands. At first, Eleanor thought she was searching for something, but then she saw the small movement repeated with care, the precise gesture of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The woman withdrew a piece of cloth, dark, sturdy, perhaps the hem of a skirt or a sleeve, and held it close to the light. From her bag, she took a needle and a small spool of thread that caught the lamp glow in a pale shimmer. It looked almost silver, though Eleanor knew it was likely just light on ordinary cotton. The woman's posture was calm. She did not hunch with strain. She sat upright, shoulders relaxed, as if sewing in a bus at midnight were as natural as stirring tea. The needle moved through fabric with a soft, deliberate rhythm. In and out, in and out. Each stitch was small, almost invisible, yet the accumulation of them was unmistakably purposeful. Eleanor watched, drawn by the steadiness of the motion. It reminded her of sutures, of the way a surgeon's hands could close a wound with patience. But this was gentler than surgery. It was repair without urgency. A quiet insistence that something torn could be made whole again. The bus swayed on a turn, and the seamstress's hand paused, not startled, simply adjusting. Her thumb smoothed the cloth. Her eyes remained soft and attentive. Eleanor found herself thinking that this woman must have spent years with fabric, learning how it behaved, how it yielded, how it held memory. Cloth was intimate. It touched skin. It absorbed warmth and scent. It carried the shape of a body even when the body was gone. Eleanor had learned intimacy of another kind, the kind that came from tending the vulnerable parts of strangers. Yet this sewing felt like its own form of care, just as quiet, just as faithful. When the bus straightened out, the seamstress resumed. The silver thread glinted faintly with each movement, like a stream catching moonlight. Eleanor's attention lingered on it longer than she expected, and she realized she had not watched anyone do something purely for its own sake in a long time. At the hospital, every motion had to serve a function: prevent infection, reduce pain, record information, maintain order. Even kindness was often squeezed into the margins. This, however, was kind and functional at once, performed with a serenity that made it feel almost like a spell. The seamstress glanced up and caught Eleanor watching. There was no sharpness in her expression, no suspicion. Only mild curiosity, like someone noticing a neighbor at the window. "Sorry," Eleanor said quietly, the word emerging before she could decide whether she needed to speak at all. It's just, you make it look easy." The woman's mouth softened into a small smile. Her face was lined but not heavily, the lines set more by concentration than by worry. "It isn't always easy," she replied, her voice low, as if respecting the bus's hush. "But it's familiar, and familiarity makes a thing gentler." Eleanor nodded. The phrase settled in her mind with a calm weight. Familiarity makes a thing gentler. She thought of the hospital again, of how she had learned to insert needles without flinching, to speak calmly even when her own heart was tired. Familiarity had indeed made her work possible, yet it had not always made it gentle. Sometimes familiarity made her numb. Sometimes it made her disappear into routine. Watching this woman, Eleanor wondered if gentleness could be practiced the way stitching could be practiced, one small act at a time. "What are you mending?" Eleanor asked, and the question felt safe. It was ordinary. It did not require confession. "A sleeve," the seamstress said, lifting the fabric slightly so Eleanor could see. "My husband's coat. He'll need it in the morning. The tier isn't big, but if you leave it, it grows. Everything grows if you leave it." Eleanor looked at the neat tier and then at the needle moving through it. The woman was right. Small damage, ignored, became larger. Eleanor felt the truth of that in her own body. She had been leaving her weariness unattended for months, perhaps longer, letting it widen quietly inside her. She had told herself she could manage. She had told herself everyone was tired. She had told herself she was meant to endure. All of that was true, and yet it did not change the fact that unattended exhaustion could become something that tore a person's spirit. The seamstress's needle paused again as the bus crossed a rough patch of road. She waited patiently, then continued. "Do you work nights?" she asked, her eyes still on the cloth. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "I'm a nurse." The woman's hands slowed, not in surprise but in recognition. "Ah," she said softly, as if the word carried respect without needing to state it. "That's hard work." Eleanor almost shrugged, almost dismissed it, as she often did. It was easier to call her work simply work than to name its weight. Yet in the seamstress's tone, there was something that invited honesty. Not dramatic honesty, but plain truth. "It can be," Eleanor admitted. "Some nights feel endless." The seamstress made another line of stitches, then nodded slightly. "Endless nights still end," she said. "They always do. Sometimes it's the only comfort, but it's enough." The bus's hum continued around them, steady as a lull. Eleanor felt the seamstress's words settle in her chest. Endless nights still end. It was simple. It was a fact. Yet it felt like a hand placed lightly on her shoulder. In the hospital, people often tried to comfort one another with bright phrases that did not fit the reality. This was not bright. It was quiet and true. It acknowledged the difficulty without making it dramatic. Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the seamstress's hands. They looked capable without being hurried. The woman's fingers pinched the fabric, guided the needle, drew the thread through with a soft pull that never jerked. Each stitch tightened the tier's edges together. It was almost invisible work, yet its effect was clear. Eleanor thought again of her own role, of how many times she had held patients together, sometimes literally, with bandages and careful turning, sometimes in a more delicate way, by speaking to them when they were afraid, by making their bodies feel less alone. She had been stitching people's nights closed, one shift after another. Yet she had not been repairing her own frayed places. The seamstress finished a line and turned the sleeve slightly, checking the seam with practiced eyes. "Cloth remembers," she said, as if continuing a thought she'd been carrying. "It remembers where it was worn thin. It remembers the shape of an elbow, the warmth of a shoulder. Even after you mend it, it doesn't forget. But it carries on. That's the point. Eleanor heard the words as if they were spoken directly into the quiet center of her mind. Cloth remembers. It sounded almost like an enchantment. She thought of her own body as cloth. She thought of her tired shoulders, her aching feet, the way her hands sometimes felt stiff with cold even indoors. She thought of how her body remembered every night she had spent under harsh lights, every time she had skipped a proper meal, every time she had held herself upright when she wanted to sit. She had been worn thin. She could pretend otherwise, but memory lived in the body. Yet the seamstress's next phrase mattered most. Even after you mend it, it doesn't forget, but it carries on. That's the point. Eleanor felt something loosen inside her, not in sorrow, but in permission. She did not need to erase what she had endured. She did not need to pretend the wear had never happened. She only needed, perhaps, to acknowledge it and offer herself some repair. She imagined, for a moment, what repair would look like for her. A cup of tea drunk slowly, a warm bath, a day when she did not fill every hour with competence, a conversation where she was not the one listening, but the one being heard. The images were simple, modest, yet they shimmered like that silver thread under the bus's light. The bus passed another lamp, and its halo swept across the seamstress's lap. The thread gleamed again. The woman tied off the knot with a small, deft motion and snipped the end. Then she smoothed the sleeve with her palm, as if blessing it. The gesture was so tender that Eleanor felt her throat tighten, surprised by the intensity of such a small thing. The seamstress folded the coat carefully and returned it to her bag. She did not look triumphant. She looked satisfied in a quiet way, as if she had simply done what needed doing and found peace in the completion. Eleanor looked down at her own hands resting on her bag. They were hands that had held scalpels passed between gloved fingers, hands that had wiped sweat from brows, hands that had written notes in cramped margins. They were not delicate hands. They were capable hands. And they deserved, she realized, the same kindness the seamstress had offered her husband's coat. They deserved to be warmed, to be rested, to be treated as belonging to someone who mattered. The seamstress leaned back in her seat, her work finished, and closed her eyes briefly. Eleanor remained awake, but her thoughts were softer now. The bus continued its steady passage through fog, the lamps outside continuing their slow, star-like procession. And in that warm, moving room, Eleanor carried the seamstress's words like a small parcel. Familiarity can make a thing gentler. Cloth remembers. Endless nights still end. Each phrase felt like a stitch closing something frayed inside her. Not all at once, but patiently, one quiet connection at a time. After the seamstress settled back, the bus seemed to grow even quieter, as if her small act of mending had stitched the very air into a calmer shape. The hum of the engine continued, steady and low, and the windows held the fog like soft curtains drawn close. Eleanor remained awake, though her body had begun to drift toward rest. Her thoughts moved slowly now, no longer knocking against the edges of worry. She watched the faint reflections in the glass, faces, lamp halos, the pale blur of her own features, and let the bus's rhythm carry her deeper into that in-between state where the mind is gentle and receptive. A few rows behind her, a sound rose so softly that at first it seemed part of the engine's vibration. It was a hum, low and careful, with no intention of being heard. Someone was not singing to entertain, not even singing with confidence. They were humming as if trying to remember something, as if the tune itself were a thread they did not wish to lose. The notes were simple, rocking back and forth in a familiar pattern. Eleanor felt her attention lift, not sharply, but like a curtain stirred by a breeze. She listened. The melody was old. It carried the shape of cradle songs and quiet evenings. It was the sort of tune that lived in a person's bones, long after the words were forgotten. Eleanor's chest tightened with recognition. Her mother had hummed that lullaby when Eleanor was small, when the house in Sussex creaked at night and the wind pressed at the windows. The tune had always been the same, steady, patient, returning again and again to the same gentle resting note. Eleanor had not thought of it in years. The hospital had no place for lullabies. Even when she spoke softly to patients, her tone was practical, shaped to calm without drifting into sentiment. Yet here, on the night bus, the melody floated up like warm breath, and Eleanor felt the memory unfurl inside her without effort. She turned her head slightly, enough to see who made the sound. In the dim light, she could make out the outline of a young man seated near the back. He wore a heavy coat, the kind issued to soldiers. Thick wool, broad shoulders, a collar that stood up as if guarding the throat from cold. The coat looked worn, the fabric dulled by use, but it had been cared for. A faint sheen on the buttons suggested regular polishing. His cap rested in his lap, held between his hands. His posture was not stiff with military formality. It was tired. Yet there was a quiet self-possession in the way he sat, as if he had learned how to be still in difficult circumstances. The humming continued for a few more bars, and then faded. The young man stared out the window, though the fog offered him nothing clear to see. Eleanor hesitated. She did not want to intrude, yet the tune had already entered her, gentle as a hand at the back of her neck. It had made her feel briefly like someone's child again, not merely someone's nurse. The feeling was tender and almost startling. Before she could overthink, she shifted slightly in her seat and spoke quietly, so her voice would not carry too far. "That's a familiar tune," she said. The young man looked up, his face turning toward her with a mild surprise that did not harden into suspicion. In the bus's amber light, his features appeared softer than his coat suggested. His eyes were tired, but there was gentleness in them, as if tiredness had worn away any desire to seem impressive. He seemed to consider whether he had been heard at all, and then he gave a small nod. "Is it?" he replied, voice low. "I didn't realize I was doing it." "It's a lullaby," Eleanor said. "My mother used to hum it." The young man's mouth curved faintly. Not quite a smile, more a quiet acknowledgement. "My gran," he said. "She used to hum it when the house went cold. Said it made the air warmer." He glanced back toward the window, then returned his gaze to Eleanor. "Funny thing, isn't it? You forget everything else, but you remember that." Eleanor felt warmth rise behind her ribs. The words were simple, but they carried something shared. "Yes," she said, "you do." They fell silent for a moment, not awkwardly, but with the ease of people who did not need to fill space. Eleanor could hear the bus's steady passage, the muted world outside, the faint rustle of the seamstress shifting in her sleep. The young man's hands remained on his cap, fingers resting along the brim as if grounding himself. Eleanor noticed, without judgment, that his knuckles were scraped, and that a thin line of old scar tissue ran along one finger. Working hands, hands that had held things heavy and unyielding. Yet the way he had hummed a lullaby suggested those hands also held softer memories. Eleanor spoke again gently. "Are you coming from work?" The young man let out a breath that could have been a laugh if it had held more sound. "Not exactly," he said. just coming from somewhere. He paused, as if deciding how much to offer. I was stationed a while back. Not overseas now. Just getting used to being here again. Eleanor nodded. She did not ask where or what he had seen. The night bus was not a place for heavy questions. She could tell by the way he spoke that he was not asking to be examined. He was simply stating a fact, as one might state the weather. She respected the boundary. The hospital had taught her to listen without prying, to allow a person to place their own truths on the table at their own pace. It takes time, Eleanor said, and the phrase came from experience more than from any particular knowledge of his life. Getting used to things again. It does, he agreed. You think you'll step back in and it will fit, but you're not the same shape as before. He said it quietly, without bitterness. It sounded like an observation made in the middle of the night, when a person is too tired to pretend. Then his gaze flicked to Eleanor's uniform collar, visible beneath her cape. You're a nurse, he added, as if the word explained something. Yes, Eleanor said. She was aware suddenly of how that word often ended conversations in a particular way. People either praised her briskly or grew uncomfortable, as if reminded of illness. Sometimes they spoke to her like a caretaker even outside the hospital. Tonight, she did not want to be placed in a role. Yet she also did not want to hide. The young man nodded again, his expression thoughtful. That's hard, he said simply. Not dramatic, not sentimental, just an acknowledgement. Eleanor felt the weight of that acknowledgement, like something warm placed in her hands. It was the same warmth she had felt earlier when the seamstress had said, "Ah," the warmth of being recognized without being used. It can be, she admitted. Sometimes I feel like I'm made of tiredness. The young man's eyes softened. I know that feeling, he said. He did not elaborate. He did not claim to understand her work fully. He only met her honesty with his own, brief and respectful. The exchange was small, but it touched something deep in Eleanor. In the hospital, she often spoke to patients with calm words, but rarely did anyone speak to her with calm understanding. People assumed nurses were built to endure. They forgot nurses were also human. The bus passed under a series of lamps, and the light moved across the young man's coat, briefly highlighting its seams and patches. Eleanor noticed a small tear near the cuff that had been stitched shut with dark thread, practical and neat. It made her think of the seamstress again, of cloth remembering. This coat, too, remembered. It had held his body in cold places. It had absorbed his sweat and his fear and his fatigue, even if those things were never spoken. The coat was a record of endurance, like Eleanor's uniform. Yet there was dignity in its wear, not shame. You said your gran hummed it when the house went cold, Eleanor said, returning gently to the lullaby. Did it work? The young man's mouth moved in a small, more definite smile this time. It did, he said. Or maybe we just believed it did. That's not nothing, is it? No, Eleanor replied. It's not nothing. She felt the bus's warmth and the lullaby's memory wrap around her like layers. Belief could be a kind of warmth. Small comforts, repeated, could build something steady. She thought of tea poured in staff rooms, of the way nurses shared biscuits and jokes to survive the night. She thought of her mother humming by the fire. The hospital had taught her to value facts, temperatures, pulse rates, charts. Yet comfort, she realized, was not always measured in numbers. Sometimes it was measured in whether a person could breathe a little easier. The young man looked down at his cap, turning it slowly in his hands. I don't usually hum, he said, almost apologetic. It just came up. It was nice, Eleanor said, and then added, because it felt important to say it plainly, "Thank you. I hadn't thought of that tune in a long time." He looked up again, and for a second his gaze held hers with an openness that felt rare in strangers. "You're welcome," he said. Then, after a pause, "It's odd, isn't it? You can sit on a bus with people you'll never see again, and still, you feel less alone." Eleanor's throat tightened gently, not with sadness but with recognition. "Yes," she said, "it is odd, and true." The conversation did not go further than that. It did not need to. The young man leaned back, his shoulders settling. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the window again, watching fog slide past like pale cloth. The lullaby's shape remained in her mind, rocking quietly. She imagined the melody as a thread stretched between her childhood and this moment, between her mother's hands and the young man's worn coat. It was a thread that said, "You have been held before, and you can be held again." As the bus continued through the softened city, Eleanor felt a subtle change in her own posture. Her shoulders were less rigid, her jaw unclenched. She did not feel suddenly restored, but she felt witnessed in a small, honest way. The young man's simple acknowledgement, "That's hard," had landed like a hand on the back, steadying without pushing. Being seen, she realized, did not require grand gestures. It could happen in the quietest exchanges, on a night bus, through a lullaby remembered and shared. And in that shared memory, Eleanor remembered herself not only as a nurse, but as a person who had once been soothed, and who still deserved soothing now. The lullaby lingered in the bus's air long after the young man's humming had faded, as if the melody had settled into the upholstery and the woodwork, and now belonged to the vehicle itself. Eleanor sat with her eyes half-lidded, letting that quiet tune echo behind her thoughts. The city outside remained softened by fog, and the lamps continued their slow procession, each one appearing like a patient star, and then slipping away. The bus's warmth held steady, and with it came a sense that time had loosened its grip. There was no clock face in Eleanor's immediate view, no sharp reminder of minutes being spent. The night felt wide and generous, as if it were giving her room to exist without being measured. At the next stop, the doors opened with their familiar breathing sound, and a gust of cold slipped in, not harsh, but bracing, like fresh water on the face. A few passengers shifted, coats tightening, shoulders lifting briefly toward ears. When the doors closed again, the bus reclaimed its warmth with calm efficiency. Eleanor watched the seamstress asleep now, her hands folded on her bag as if still guarding the mended coat. The young man in the soldier's coat stared out the window, his cap quiet in his lap. The bowler-hatted man had leaned his head back and closed his eyes. These strangers, each holding their own weariness, made Eleanor feel less singular in hers. A soft sound came from the seat across the aisle, and Eleanor turned her head. An older woman sat there, newly noticeable, not because she had moved much, but because Eleanor's attention had begun to widen. The woman wore a dark wool coat and a hat pinned neatly in place. Her cheeks were round with cold, and her eyes had the steady brightness of someone who had lived through many winters and learned not to dramatize them. Beside her feet sat a basket, covered with a cloth, as if protecting something fragile or precious. The woman's gloved hands rested on its handle with a kind of quiet ownership. When the bus swayed slightly, the basket shifted. The woman steadied it without fuss, and then, perhaps noticing Eleanor's glance, gave a small nod. It was not a greeting that demanded response. It was simply a recognition that they shared this moving room. Eleanor returned the nod. She might have left it there. The night invited discretion, yet something in the older woman's calm steadiness, in the basket held close as if it carried warmth, drew Eleanor gently outward. "Is it heavy?" Eleanor asked, her voice low. The older woman looked at the basket as if considering the question honestly. "Not too heavy," she said. "Just enough to remind you you're carrying something." Her tone held mild humor, but also a quiet affection, as if she were speaking about more than weight. Eleanor felt a small smile touch her mouth. "That sounds familiar," she said. And then, because the words felt true, she added, "I've been carrying a great deal lately." The woman's eyes moved to Eleanor's uniform collar again, the hint of white beneath the cape, and understanding settled on her face without any need for explanation. "Hospital," she said softly, not as a question but as a gentle conclusion. "Yes," Eleanor replied. She did not feel exposed by it. She felt seen, in the same calm way she had felt seen by the seamstress and the young man. It was as if the bus itself were introducing her to small forms of recognition, one after another, like beads offered in the palm. The older woman's hands moved to the cloth covering her basket. She lifted one corner and the faintest scent drifted upward. Something sweet, something warm, a smell like sugar browned in a pan. "I've got a few little things," she said, almost conspiratorially, as if sharing a secret. "Not much, but enough." From beneath the cloth, she took out a small sweet, wrapped in thin paper. The paper was folded neatly at the ends, the sort of careful wrapping that suggested practice and pride. She held it out to Eleanor with an ease that made refusal feel unnecessary. There was no insistence in her gesture, only offer. Eleanor hesitated for a heartbeat, not because she did not want it, but because she had grown used to not receiving. In the hospital, she gave cups of tea. She gave reassurance. She gave instructions. She gave her hands. Receiving was not her habit. Yet the sweet sat in the woman's palm like a small warm coin, and Eleanor realized she wanted to accept this ordinary kindness. "Thank you," she said, and unwrapped it carefully. The sweet was simple, perhaps a toffee or a small piece of fudge, soft enough to yield without difficulty. She placed it on her tongue and felt its warmth spread slowly, the sugar melting into a gentle richness. It tasted of butter and patience, of kitchens and quiet evenings. The sensation was so comforting that Eleanor's eyes stung faintly, not with tears exactly, but with the body's response to something unexpectedly kind. The older woman watched her with a mild satisfaction that carried no pride. "There," she said. "That's better. You look like you've forgotten what sweet tastes like." Eleanor gave a short, quiet laugh. "I might have," she admitted. She let the sweetness settle. It felt like warmth made edible. "Did you make them?" "I did," the woman replied. "Just a little batch. My sister likes them. She says they make the day feel less sharp." She paused, as if weighing whether to speak more, then added, "We take turns with small comforts. It keeps things livable." The phrase, "keeps things livable," felt as practical and as important as any instruction Eleanor had ever given a trainee nurse. Livable. Not perfect, not grand. Simply livable. Eleanor thought of the staff room at the hospital, the chipped mugs, the kettle that never seemed to cool, the way a biscuit could feel like mercy at 3 a.m. She realized she had been surviving on duty alone, forgetting that survival was not meant to be only grit. It could also be softness, offered in small measures. The bus continued its steady movement. Outside, the fog thickened again, turning the street into a pale corridor. Inside, the older woman's presence felt like a small hearth. Eleanor found herself wanting to know her, though she knew the bus was a temporary world. Still, the night did not punish small curiosity. "Are you going far?" Eleanor asked. "Not far," the older woman said. "Just across town. My sister's not well, not lately. Not ill in a dramatic way, you understand. Just worn down, like cloth that's been used too long." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the sleeping seamstress, as if the bus's earlier talk had placed metaphors in the air. "So I bring her little things. She pretends she doesn't need them, and I pretend I believe her." Eleanor's chest warmed again, this time with recognition. "That sounds like sisters," she said. "It does," the woman agreed, and her voice softened. "We do not always fix one another, but we can remind one another we are worth tending." The words landed gently but firmly. Worth tending. Eleanor turned them over in her mind the way she had turned her punched ticket, feeling their edges. Worth tending was a phrase nurses might say about patients, but rarely about themselves. Eleanor felt again that quiet ache of having been useful and unseen. She had tended so many bodies, and yet she had not always believed her own life deserved tending in the same way. The older woman spoke as if it were simply obvious. Eleanor looked down at her hands resting on her bag. Her fingers still carried the faint sweetness, sticky in a way that made her feel oddly grounded. "I suppose we all need little things," she said, almost to herself. "We do," the older woman replied, "and we need them without shame. People act as though needing comfort is a weakness, but the world is hard enough. There is no medal for making it harder." Eleanor felt her shoulders loosen further. The sentence did not sound like advice. It sounded like a life learned. She thought of all the times she had refused a second cup of tea because she felt too busy, all the times she had told herself she would rest later, all the times she had swallowed hunger because someone else's need felt more urgent. She had treated her own comfort as optional. Yet the older woman spoke as if comfort were part of endurance, not an indulgence, but a tool. The older woman adjusted the cloth over her basket again, tucking it neatly. "Tea is the same," she said. "A cup doesn't solve the world, but it changes the moment." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "it does." They spoke for a few minutes more, about ordinary things, how the weather could change a person's bones, how London fog had a personality of its own, how certain shops always smelled of bread even before dawn. The conversation was light, but it was not empty. Each ordinary observation carried a quiet respect for life as it was actually lived. Eleanor found herself breathing more deeply as they spoke, as if her body trusted the calmness of these words. Eventually, the older woman grew quiet again, and the bus's hush returned to the foreground. Eleanor leaned back and let the sweetness linger on her tongue. She felt the warmth of the toffee or fudge spreading into her chest like a small ember. She thought of the older woman taking turns with her sister, of the seamstress mending a coat, of the young man humming a lullaby, each one offering something modest and real. No one was performing heroics. No one was saving anyone else. They were simply making the night more bearable, stitch by stitch, sweet by sweet, note by note. Eleanor realized that this, too, was dignity. The quiet practice of making life livable, not by conquering it, but by softening its sharp edges where one could. Being seen mattered, yes, but so did seeing. Seeing the older woman's basket, seeing the careful wrapping, seeing the gesture of a hand extended without demand. In noticing these things, Eleanor felt herself return to herself in a new way, not as a nurse scanning for symptoms, but as a person remembering how to receive. The bus rolled onward, warm and steady, and Eleanor held the older woman's words like a warm parcel in her mind. Worth tending. No medal for making it harder. A cup changes the moment. These were not grand philosophies. They were plain truths, offered gently in the middle of the night, and Eleanor felt them settling into her like nourishment, quiet and sustaining, as the city outside remained wrapped in fog, and the bus carried them all toward whatever morning would bring. The night bus continued to move through London as if it knew every bend and lamp by heart, and Eleanor found herself settling into the ride the way one settles into a familiar chair. The sweetness the older woman had offered still warmed her mouth, not only as flavor, but as a lingering sense of having been cared for without ceremony. The fog outside remained thick, yet it no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a blanket drawn up around the city, softening its hard outlines, asking nothing of those who traveled through it. Inside the bus, the air had taken on the calm scent of wool and warmed breath. It was not bright or cheerful, but it was steady, which felt like a kind of mercy. A few stops passed in quiet succession. Each time the bus sighed to a halt, the doors opened, and the outside cold reached in briefly, like a hand testing the room. Each time, the bus closed itself again, reclaiming its warmth. People rose and stepped down without hurry, their coats buttoned, their heads slightly bowed against the weather. They vanished quickly into the fog, becoming silhouettes and then nothing. New passengers appeared in the same manner, first as shapes, then as faces, stepping up into the amber interior as if entering a small sanctuary. The exchanges were always brief: coins, tickets, a nod. Yet within those brief moments, Eleanor began to notice something she had not fully seen before. The conductor, moving with his tidy composure, did not treat the passengers as a stream of anonymous bodies. He looked at them, not in the scanning way of someone assessing trouble, but in the attentive way of someone recognizing presence. When a man in a flat cap boarded at a later stop, the conductor's voice softened slightly. "Evening, Mr. Pritchard," he said, and the man's shoulders loosened as if the name itself had unknotted him. When a woman with a small parcel stepped aboard, the conductor tilted his head and asked, "Home late again, Mrs. Lacey?" She gave a tired smile and answered, "Only just," as if the question had welcomed her more than the warmth had. Eleanor sat very still, listening. Names drifted down the aisle like small lanterns. They did not flare. They did not demand attention. They simply lit the air for a moment and made the bus feel less like a vehicle and more like a neighborhood in motion. The conductor's memory seemed effortless, as if he had tucked each passenger into his mind with the same care he tucked his uniform collar into place. Eleanor found herself quietly astonished. In the hospital, names were written on charts and bed tags, yet it was painfully easy for a person to become the appendectomy in 3 or the pneumonia in 7. The staff did not mean cruelty by it. It was a shorthand born of pressure, yet it shaved away something human. Here, in the most ordinary of places, this conductor kept the human part intact with a single word. The effect on the passengers was subtle, but visible. A name made someone lift their head. A remembered habit made someone's mouth soften. "Same stop, Tommy?" the conductor asked a young clerk with ink-stained fingers, and Tommy nodded, reassured, as if the route itself were steadied by being acknowledged. Eleanor watched these exchanges and felt her chest grow quiet in a new way. It was not merely that the conductor was kind. It was that he practiced kindness as a matter of routine, as if attention were part of the job description, as essential as keeping time. The bus swayed gently, and Eleanor's punched ticket shifted in her glove. She had kept it there, not from any practical need, but because she liked the faint reminder of its edge against her palm, proof of passage, proof of belonging. She thought of the seamstress's silver thread, of the older woman's basket and sweets, of the young man's lullaby, and now of this conductor's names. Each was a small thing, and yet each had changed the air around her. Small things, she was beginning to realize, were not small in their effect. They were the fibers of endurance. They were what made a long night livable. The conductor returned down the aisle again, his footsteps quiet on the worn floorboards. He checked tickets with a glance, but his gaze never felt dismissive. He paused by the older woman with the basket and asked, "Still all right there, Mrs. Finch?" She nodded and patted the cloth covering her basket, as if to confirm that all was well in her small cargo of comforts. He leaned slightly toward the seamstress, who had roused from sleep and was blinking in the dim light. "You're nearly to your stop, Maud," he told her, and she murmured thanks, adjusting her bag as if grateful not to have to watch the fog for signs. Eleanor watched, startled by the intimacy of it. Not the intimacy of friendship, but of repeated contact, of shared roots and quiet familiarity. These night passengers were not strangers to him. They were people he had carried before, people whose lives he had glimpsed in fragments, habitual stops, tired faces, baskets of sweets, parcels held close. He did not know their whole stories, but he knew enough to greet them as themselves. Eleanor thought of her own work again. She knew patients' details, yes, but the details she gathered were often stripped of gentleness by necessity. Here, the details were gathered and held like something valuable. The conductor reached Eleanor's row and paused. For a moment, he simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on the brass rail, the other holding his ticket machine. His face was calm, but his eyes held the quiet clarity of someone who could read the atmosphere of a room. Eleanor had known nurses like that, women who could tell at a glance, who needed a blanket and who needed a word. She felt suddenly aware of herself, of the way she sat upright out of habit, of the faint stiffness in her shoulders, of the dark half-moons under her eyes that the hospital mirrors never showed kindly. He looked at her gloved hand where the ticket edge still pressed against her palm. He did not ask for it. He had already punched it. Instead, he looked at her face, and his expression shifted a fraction, as if he were doing something simple and deliberate. Seeing. "All right, miss?" he asked again, in the same plain tone he had used earlier. But this time the question landed differently. It was not routine now. It was specific. It was asked as if her state mattered. Eleanor's throat tightened gently. She was unused to this sort of attention from someone who had no reason to offer it. In the hospital, people asked nurses how they were as a politeness, and then hurried past before an answer could be given. Doctors asked it while reading charts, already thinking of the next task. Patients sometimes asked it, but often with a desperation that required Eleanor to become strong again immediately. This question felt different. It was asked without haste, without demand, without expectation that she would perform reassurance in return. She could have answered automatically. She could have said, "I'm fine," and let it drift away. Yet the bus's warmth, the night's softness, and the conductor's calm gaze made honesty feel possible. Not dramatic honesty, not a confession, just a truthful sentence, small enough to fit the moment. "I'm tired," Eleanor said quietly, "but I'm managing." The conductor nodded, as if she had handed him a valid ticket. "That's something," he said. Then, after a short pause, as if choosing his words with the same care he chose his steps, he added, "You look like you've been doing your best." Eleanor felt the words land in her chest with a surprising weight. Doing your best. It was a phrase people said to children, or to students, or to someone facing a trial. No one had said it to her in months. The hospital expected competence. It expected endurance. It expected the steady functioning of a machine that happened to have a human face. To hear a stranger acknowledge her effort, not her role, not her output, but her effort, made something inside her loosen. She did not need praise. She needed recognition that she was a person who had been working hard, and that this fact could be named without embarrassment. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried more than politeness. The conductor gave another small nod and moved on. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it changed the shape of the space around Eleanor. She felt, in a quiet and almost startling way, less invisible. Not because he knew her name. He did not. But because he had looked at her as if her inner life existed. Being seen, she realized, did not always require a long conversation. Sometimes it was offered in a brief pause, in a steady tone, in a sentence that named the truth without making it heavy. The bus continued through the fog, its lamps outside still passing like low stars. Eleanor leaned back and let the conductor's words settle. "You've been doing your best." In the hospital, she had often held patients' dignity carefully, covering them with blankets, speaking to them as adults, explaining what was happening instead of treating them as bodies to be moved. Yet she had not always held her own dignity with the same care. She had dismissed her fatigue as weakness, her need for rest as indulgence. Now, in the hush of the night bus, a stranger's simple recognition made her see the ordinary endurance of her own life as something worth respecting. She looked down at her hands again, at the glove where the punched ticket rested like a small token. The holes in the paper were neat. They marked her passage, yes, but they also marked something else. A moment when she had been acknowledged without requirement. Eleanor breathed in slowly and let the breath out, feeling the bus carry her forward. The night was still long, but it no longer felt endless. It felt inhabited, stitched together by small attentions, names remembered, questions asked without hurry, and the quiet dignity of simply continuing. After the conductor moved on, the bus seemed to settle into an even deeper quiet, as though his brief words had smoothed the air. Eleanor sat with her shoulders resting more naturally against the seat back, her hands no longer clenched around her bag strap. The warmth in the bus had become familiar now, no longer startling in contrast to the cold outside, but steady, dependable. It felt like being inside a moving house, a small corridor of comfort drawn through a sleeping city. The fog remained thick against the windows, yet Eleanor no longer felt shut out by it. The mist was simply there, soft and patient, making the outside world less demanding to look at. The route began to incline slightly, and Eleanor sensed, without seeing clearly, that they were approaching the river. There was a particular change in London air near the Thames, even in winter. An added dampness, a faint mineral scent, a coolness that felt older than the streets. The bus's engine shifted subtly as it climbed, and the tires made a different sound on the roadway, as if the surface had changed. Eleanor leaned a fraction toward the window, searching the fog for signs, and then she saw it. The faint suggestion of open space ahead, a widening of darkness where buildings fell away. The lamps became more spaced, their halos larger, as though the light needed to reach farther. The bus rolled onto the bridge with a steady ease. The sensation was immediate. Bridges always changed the body's awareness, even when the view was hidden. There was a slight lift, a sense of passing over something unseen yet powerful. Eleanor felt the river beneath them not as an image, but as a presence, like a breath moving under a door. The fog over water seemed denser, smoother, as if the Thames had called the mist to itself. The lamp halos hovered above that invisible expanse like pale moons suspended low. For a moment, the city felt very far away, even though it was still there on both sides. The bus, moving over the river, seemed to enter a space where London loosened its grip. Eleanor watched the darkness beyond the bridge railing. She could not see the water clearly, but she sensed its slow movement. It was a kind of quiet motion that did not hurry and did not stop. The river did not care about night shifts or timetables. It moved as it always moved, carrying its own steady history. The thought made Eleanor's own fatigue feel smaller, not in a dismissive way, but in a soothing way. It reminded her that her exhaustion was part of a larger pattern. Human work, human endurance, repeating and passing on, like water under bridges. The bus's interior remained warm, yet the bridge seemed to invite a different kind of quiet. Conversations that might have started faded before they became words. Even the rustle of coats seemed softer. A few passengers lifted their heads, as if the bridge prompted a gentle attention. The young man in the soldier's coat looked out the window again, gaze steady. The seamstress, Maud, adjusted her bag as if preparing for her stop. Mrs. Finch with the basket held her hands still, as if listening for something. The conductor stood near the front, his posture attentive but calm. In that moment, Eleanor felt that they were not merely crossing the river. They were crossing into a different state of being. Her mind drifted back to the hospital again, but the memories came in a changed light. She thought of the hours she had given, and instead of feeling only drained, she felt a quiet respect for the sheer quantity of care contained in those hours. There had been the elderly woman's wrist under her hand, the child's fevered forehead, the young mother's trembling breath after a difficult delivery. There had been whispered instructions and small jokes traded at the nurse's station to keep spirits from collapsing. Eleanor had given attention until attention itself felt like an empty cup, and yet she had kept pouring. She had done it because she believed in the work. She still did, but belief did not erase the fact that she sometimes felt her own name dissolving into the word nurse. On the bridge, with the river unseen below, Eleanor found herself thinking of her name in a new way. Eleanor Hart. 2 simple words. They had belonged to her long before she wore a uniform. They belonged to her when she was a girl running through a garden, when she was a student learning how to fold bandages, when she was a young woman writing her first notes in careful script. The hospital used her name mostly on rotas and paperwork. Patients rarely knew it. They called her nurse or sister. Doctors sometimes called her Heart in passing, as if her name were a tool to summon her function. Tonight, hearing the conductor speak to others by name had awakened something. Eleanor realized she missed hearing her own name spoken gently, not as a summons, but as recognition. The bus moved further across the bridge. The lamps passed slowly, each one a pale ribbon of light sliding over the windows. Eleanor watched her reflection again, but the bridge's darkness made it harder to see herself. It was as if the river beneath them had taken the image away, leaving only the sensation of her own presence. She felt her body's tiredness clearly, the ache in her feet, the heaviness in her back, the faint throb behind her eyes. Yet she also felt something else, quieter and steadier. She was still here. She had made it to this bus. She was sitting in warmth. She was breathing. She was being carried. That simple fact felt like a kind of victory, though not the loud sort. It was a victory made of persistence. A phrase the seamstress had said returned to her. "You're not the same shape as before." The young man had said something like that too, in his own way. Eleanor understood it now in her bones. She was not the same shape as she had been when she began nursing. The work had shaped her. It had strengthened her, yes, but it had also worn her thin in places. It had taught her to be calm under pressure, but it had also taught her to hide her own needs. She had become a person who could hold others while forgetting she too needed holding. On the bridge, above the quiet river, she allowed herself to admit that. The admission did not frighten her. It felt like truth, and truth held gently was not dangerous. The bus reached the midpoint of the bridge, where the fog seemed thickest. The lamp halos blurred into soft circles, overlapping slightly like layered petals. The world outside was almost entirely abstract. Light, shadow, mist. Eleanor found it oddly beautiful. It reminded her of the moments in the hospital when a patient drifted into sleep and the room became quiet, the harshness of pain softened by rest. The fog was doing that to London now, covering the sharp edges and letting the city breathe. Eleanor imagined for a moment that the bridge was not only a physical crossing, but a passage between versions of herself. The Eleanor who had stepped out of the hospital earlier had been wrapped in exhaustion like armor. She had felt hollow, defined by what she had given. The Eleanor sitting on this bridge now felt different. She was still tired, yes, but she had been offered small acknowledgments, stitches of conversation, parcels of warmth, a lullaby, a conductor's steady gaze. Each had reminded her that she was not only a caretaker, she was a person traveling through the night, carrying her own history, deserving of her own tenderness. She thought of morning, not morning as a rush to sleep and then wake again for another shift, but morning as a gentle light that would eventually change the fog's color. She pictured herself arriving home, removing her shoes, letting her feet rest on the floor without needing to move again. She pictured the kettle on her own stove, the steam rising, the cup warming her hands. She pictured herself, for once, not immediately collapsing into bed with her mind still running, but pausing to notice her own quiet. The images were modest, like the sweets in Mrs. Finch's basket, but they felt like real possibilities. As the bus neared the end of the bridge, Eleanor felt a subtle shift, as if the city were returning. The shapes of buildings began to reappear through the fog, first as silhouettes, then as dimly defined forms. The lamps grew closer together again, their halos smaller. The bus descended slightly, the engine changing its tone, the roadway sound altering. They were leaving the river's open hush behind and returning to streets. Yet Eleanor carried the bridge's calm with her. She carried the sensation of crossing over something unseen and enduring. When the bus rolled off the bridge and back onto land, Eleanor realized her breathing had become deeper without her noticing. Her shoulders felt less tight. The ache in her body remained, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like evidence of having lived through another night, evidence of effort, dignity in ordinary endurance, the older woman might have called it. And in that moving warmth, with the river behind them and the fog still soft at the windows, Eleanor felt herself gently turning toward a morning self, one who would still work, still care, still endure, but who might also remember more often, to speak her own name quietly inside her chest, and to believe she was worth tending. After the bridge, the city returned in softened layers, as if London were reassembling itself from mist and lamplight. The bus moved through streets that felt familiar in a distant way, not because Eleanor knew every corner, but because the city's night character was consistent. Quiet doorways, shuttered shops, windows with curtains drawn tight against cold. The lamps now came more frequently again, and each halo swept across the interior like a slow tide of light, brightening faces for a moment and then letting them sink back into amber shadow. Eleanor remained in a calmer state than she had expected to reach after such a shift. Her fatigue was still present, but it had lost some of its sharpness. It felt less like a weight pressing her down and more like a blanket she could carry without shame. A few passengers stepped off after the bridge, disappearing quickly into fog as if swallowed by a patient sea. The seamstress, Maud, stood when the bus slowed near her stop. She nodded once to the conductor, who returned the nod and murmured her name in the same even tone. Maud paused near Eleanor's seat as she moved down the aisle, perhaps recognizing her from their earlier exchange. "Take care, love," she said softly, and the words were plain but warm. Then she stepped down into the mist, her figure fading until she became nothing more than a darker shade of fog, and then nothing at all. The bus regained motion, and Eleanor's attention drifted to a man seated several rows ahead on the opposite side. He had been there for some time, but now he became distinct in Eleanor's perception, as if her mind, soothed by the night, had room to notice him properly. He wore a dark overcoat with the collar turned up, and he held a folded newspaper open in front of him. Under the bus's dim light, the paper looked pale, almost luminous, its pages catching the lamp glow and reflecting it back in a gentle wash. The effect made the newspaper seem less like a document of the world's troubles and more like a small moon held in the man's hands. He read slowly, not with the sharp concentration of someone chasing information, but with the measured attention of someone completing a ritual. Occasionally, he adjusted the fold, smoothing the crease with his palm. The paper made faint rustling sounds, soft as leaves. Eleanor could not read the headlines from where she sat, and she did not need to. She knew the usual content: politics, shortages, distant conflicts that still cast their shadows, small triumphs presented as proofs of national stamina. She had been hearing such things for years, in snatches from radios and conversations in queues. The newspaper, at this hour, felt like a relic of daylight pulled into the night. The man seemed aware of his surroundings in a quiet way. He did not look at anyone directly, but his posture suggested a person who noticed. When the bus swayed, he steadied the paper without irritation. When a lamp halo passed, he blinked and continued reading. There was patience in him, and a kind of gentleness in the way he handled something that was, ultimately, disposable. Eleanor found herself drawn to that gentleness. In the hospital, she often saw people crumple papers, toss them aside, treat objects as tools without care. This man treated the paper as if even bad news deserved to be held properly. At the next stop, when no one boarded and the bus remained quiet, the man folded the newspaper more tightly, as if concluding a section. He glanced up briefly, and his eyes met Eleanor's in passing. It was not an invasive look. It was more like a moment of mutual recognition. Two people awake in the same hour. Eleanor's instinct was to look away, but she did not feel she had to. The bus, by now, had taught her that small exchanges could be safe. The man gave a slight nod, polite and minimal. Eleanor returned it. Then, as if the night made conversation feel permissible, he spoke in a low voice that carried across the short distance without disturbing the others. "Fog's thick tonight," he said, as if offering a neutral observation that anyone could accept. "It is," Eleanor replied. "It makes the city feel quieter." He nodded again. "Yes, like it's been wrapped up. You almost forget there's trouble in the world for a bit." The words were simple, but they touched something in Eleanor. Trouble in the world. She thought of the hospital, where trouble was not an abstract headline, but a body in pain, a fever, a wound, a frightened gaze. Yet she understood what he meant. The fog softened the edges of everything, even the news. It gave a person permission to exist without constantly bracing. He shifted the newspaper in his lap, the pale pages catching the light again. "You work late?" he asked, and his eyes flicked briefly toward her uniform collar. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'm coming from the hospital." "Ah," he murmured, and the sound carried that same quiet respect she had heard from others tonight. "That's a heavy kind of late." Eleanor felt the phrase settle in her mind. A heavy kind of late. She would have smiled if her face had not been so tired, but she did feel a softening. "It can be," she agreed. "Some nights it feels as if the hours stack up." The man's gaze moved to the window, then back to his newspaper, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I read the evening paper," he said, almost apologetically. "Not because I enjoy it. I don't. But it keeps me tethered, makes me feel I haven't disappeared into my own head." Eleanor understood at once. The hospital could do the opposite. It could tether a person so tightly to tasks that the inner life vanished. Yet she could also disappear into her own thoughts after a difficult shift, replaying moments, worrying at decisions, carrying sorrow home like a hidden weight. "I know what you mean," she said. "Sometimes it helps to hold something ordinary, something that belongs to the outside world." "Yes," he replied. "Exactly. Ordinary. Even if the news isn't pleasant, it's still part of the shared day." He smoothed the paper again, the gesture deliberate. "And I like the way it ends," he added, his voice almost lighter. "The weather, the little notices. It reminds me that life is still made of small things." The mention of weather made Eleanor think of Mrs. Finch's sweets, of Maud's stitches, of the lullaby hummed in the dark. Small things. The bus itself was a small thing in a way, just a route, just a vehicle. Yet it had become a kind of moving world where those small things mattered. Eleanor felt a quiet agreement rise in her chest. The man folded the newspaper further until it was a neat rectangle. "Sometimes I think people expect us to hold everything," he said, as if continuing a thought he rarely spoke aloud. "Hold the whole world's weight, but we aren't meant to. We can hold what's in front of us, a page, a cup, a conversation." He looked at Eleanor, and there was no drama in his expression, only steadiness. "You can't hold more than that without breaking." Eleanor's throat tightened gently. She thought of her own habit of holding too much, patients' fears, colleagues' fatigue, the unspoken expectations that a nurse would remain composed no matter what. She had held it all like a tray balanced too high, never letting it tilt. "That's true," she said quietly, "but it's easy to forget." "It is," he agreed. "That's why I fold the paper carefully." His mouth curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile, almost self-deprecating. "It's a small act, but it reminds me I can be gentle, even with something that will be thrown away." The phrase struck Eleanor deeply. Gentle, even with something that will be thrown away. How often had she treated herself as if her comfort were disposable? How often had she pushed herself through hunger and fatigue, as if her own body were a tool meant to wear out? The man's gentle ritual with a newspaper made her realize that gentleness was a practice, not a mood. It could be applied to anything, and therefore, perhaps, it could be applied to oneself. They sat in silence for a few moments. The bus moved on, steady as breath. The newspaper rested folded in the man's lap, still pale under the light, still like a small moon. Eleanor watched the lamp halos slide past outside, and she felt her thoughts settle into a calmer arrangement. The news would always exist. Trouble would always exist. The hospital would always require her. Yet in the middle of that, there were rituals of gentleness that could keep a person from becoming only a vessel for weight. The man lifted the folded paper, and tucked it into his coat pocket. He did it with care, as if placing away something meaningful. Then he leaned back, letting his head rest against the seat, eyes half closed. Eleanor sensed that their conversation had reached its natural end, like a paragraph concluding without needing more. She did not feel the need to fill the space. She felt grateful for it, for the calm way the man had spoken about holding only what could be held. As the bus continued through fog-softened streets, Eleanor let the idea remain with her. A page, a cup, a conversation, small things that tethered a person to life. She thought of her own home again, of the kettle, of her bed, of the quiet she would soon enter. She imagined folding her own exhaustion the way the man folded his newspaper, not crumpling it, not denying it, but handling it with a kind of gentle respect, acknowledging its presence without letting it define her entirely. The bus rolled onward, and Eleanor felt, in a quiet and steady way, that she was learning something she had forgotten, that dignity could live in ordinary rituals, and that being gentle toward objects, toward others, toward oneself, was not weakness. It was a way of staying whole while the world continued to turn. The hours felt thinner now, as if the night itself were beginning to loosen and prepare for dawn, though the windows still held only fog and lamplight. The bus's interior had grown more familiar with each mile, and Eleanor sensed that the vehicle had become a kind of shared living room for those who remained aboard. Fewer passengers sat now. The seats held more empty spaces, and the hush had deepened, not into loneliness, but into a quieter intimacy. The air was warm and slightly stale in the way of rooms that have sheltered breath for a long time, and yet it remained comforting, like the inside of a coat. Eleanor sat with her head resting back, eyes open but soft, feeling the steady movement carry her onward without requiring any decision from her tired mind. They approached another stop, and the bus slowed with its patient exhale. The brakes sighed. The floorboards creaked faintly under the shift of weight. Outside, the fog looked especially dense, the lamps' halos larger and blurrier, as though the city had been wrapped in thicker wool. Eleanor expected the usual briskness of a stop, doors opening, someone stepping down, the bus continuing. Yet this stop unfolded differently. There was no hurry in it. The doors opened, and the cold air entered softly, and for a moment the bus seemed to pause, not only in motion, but in spirit, as if allowing the night to take a longer breath. A man stood to get off, seated near the front. He moved slowly, not with infirmity exactly, but with the deliberate care of someone whose body had learned to conserve its strength. He adjusted his scarf, gathered his bag, and stepped into the aisle. The bus did not jolt. No one behind him sighed or shifted with impatience. The conductor waited, one hand resting lightly on the pole, his posture easy. Even the driver remained still, hands on the wheel without tension. The man took his time moving toward the door, each step steady and unforced, as if the bus itself were giving him permission to move at the speed his body could manage. Eleanor watched the scene with a quiet wonder. In daylight London, people were forever pushing, weaving, urging time forward. Even in the hospital, urgency was a constant, sometimes necessary, sometimes merely habitual. Yet here, on this night bus, a man could take his time descending into fog, and the world did not punish him for it. The atmosphere made Eleanor's chest loosen. She realized how tightly she had been living inside a sense of being rushed, as if every minute must be conquered or justified. The man reached the door and stepped down carefully, one foot finding the wet pavement before the other followed. The fog swallowed him almost immediately, as it had swallowed others. Yet the moment lingered. The doors remained open a little longer than strictly necessary, and cold air brushed Eleanor's face, clean and bracing. It did not feel like a threat. It felt like a reminder that the world existed beyond warm interiors, and that it could be met gently, rather than fought. No one boarded. The conductor glanced briefly down the street, as if checking out of habit, then gave the driver a small nod. The doors closed with their soft clatter, and the bus resumed its motion, unhurried. The stop had lasted only a little longer than usual, perhaps a matter of seconds, and yet Eleanor felt as if she had been given something significant. Time. Not a vast expanse, not enough to fix a life, but a small pocket of unpressured time, offered quietly and without explanation. Her mind turned inward. She began to notice her own body again, not with irritation or judgment, but with the calm attention she offered patience. She noticed the ache in her calves, the stiffness at the base of her spine, the faint soreness behind her shoulder blades where the bag strap had pressed. She noticed the dryness of her lips, the tired heaviness in her eyelids. In the hospital, she would have cataloged these sensations only to push them aside. They would have been inconvenient data. Now, in the bus's warm sway, she allowed herself to register them as facts that deserved care. She shifted slightly, adjusting her posture so her back rested more comfortably against the seat. The movement was small, but it felt like an act of kindness. She let her hands rest openly on her lap instead of gripping her bag. The punched ticket still sat folded in her glove, a small proof of passage. She could feel its edge when she flexed her fingers. She thought of the conductor who remembered names, of the seamstress with silver thread, of Mrs. Finch's sweets, of the young man's lullaby, of the newspaper folded with care. Each interaction had been modest, and yet together they formed a kind of quiet instruction. Life could be approached gently, even when it was heavy. The bus turned onto a quieter road where the buildings seemed lower, the street lamps fewer. Eleanor watched a row of small houses pass, each with a darkened window, each holding sleeping lives. Behind those windows, there were beds and kitchens and teacups, small domestic worlds that continued regardless of hospital shifts or news headlines. Eleanor felt a mild ache of longing, not dramatic, just present. She wanted her own small world again. She wanted her own kettle, her own chair, her own silence that belonged to her. The desire felt clean, not selfish. It felt like a natural need, like thirst. She realized how often she had denied herself that need in small ways. She had stayed late to help when she could have gone home. She had taken extra shifts without pausing to consider whether her body could bear them. She had told herself she was young enough, strong enough, needed enough. There was truth in that. Yet there was also truth in the fact that her endurance was not infinite. The bus, by pausing without hurry at a stop, had quietly demonstrated something she rarely permitted herself: that moving slower was not failure. It was sometimes wisdom. It was sometimes care. At the next stop, this lesson repeated itself in a different form. A young woman stood to get off, carrying a small handbag. She moved with that careful grace of someone who did not wish to disturb the quiet. The conductor stepped aside slightly to give her room, his posture suggesting patience rather than procedure. The woman paused at the door for a brief moment as if listening to the fog, then stepped down and vanished. Again, there was no hurry, no sense of time being wasted. The bus simply held the pause and then continued. Eleanor felt her breathing deepen. The rhythm of it matched the bus's sway. she began to notice the simple pleasure of inhaling warm air and exhaling without constraint. In the hospital, her breathing often became shallow, held tight by focus and urgency. Here, it could be full. The fullness felt like a return to something basic and necessary, like remembering how to drink water after hours of forgetting. As the bus rolled on, Eleanor became aware of another change. She was no longer bracing herself against the night. Earlier, when she had boarded, she had been a rigid bundle of fatigue, holding herself together through habit. Now her inner posture felt softer. She did not feel weak. She felt human. She felt as if she had stepped out of the role of nurse for a little while and returned to being Eleanor, a woman in a cape, riding home through fog. The shift was subtle, yet it was profound. She had not realized how much of her identity had been pressed into the shape of her work. The bus's warm interior light continued its gentle breathing, brightening under lamps, dimming between them. Eleanor watched the pattern and found it soothing. Light and dark, light and dark. Nothing abrupt, nothing dramatic. The world outside remained muffled, but the muffling no longer felt like isolation. It felt like protection. She thought of the conductor's earlier words. "You look like you've been doing your best." Doing your best did not mean driving oneself into the ground. Doing your best might also mean knowing when to pause, when to accept a sweet, when to let a lullaby remind you of childhood, when to fold a newspaper carefully instead of crumpling it. Doing your best might mean letting oneself be seen and letting oneself rest. Another stop came. The bus slowed, doors opening, and again no one hurried. Eleanor felt a quiet gratitude rise in her chest for this ordinary mercy, a world that allowed slow movement. She did not know whether London at large was kind. She knew it could be harsh, indifferent, hurried. Yet this bus, this route, this hour had carved out a pocket of gentleness within the city's vastness, and she had been allowed to sit inside it. The bus resumed its steady motion, and Eleanor leaned back, letting the warmth settle into her bones. She did not feel suddenly transformed. She still carried the weight of her shift, the fatigue of many nights. But she felt less trapped by it. She felt as if she had been given, through small pauses where no one hurried, permission to treat herself with the same patience she so readily offered others. And that permission, quiet and unspoken, made the night feel not like something to survive, but like something she could pass through with dignity, carried gently toward morning. Somewhere beneath the bus's steady hum, the night began to change its mind. It did not announce the shift with any dramatic flourish. There was no sudden clearing of fog, no chorus of birds, no sharp line where darkness ended and morning began. Instead, the change arrived in the smallest adjustments of color and texture, as if the world were quietly turning a page. Eleanor noticed it first in the lamps. Their halos, once heavy and golden, began to look paler at the edges, their glow less like fire and more like pearl. The fog beyond the windows seemed to lift by a fraction, not enough to reveal London clearly, but enough to let the city's shapes appear with slightly firmer outlines. The darkness was still present, yet it felt less absolute, as though it had begun to thin. Inside the bus, this subtle light did something gentle to the faces of the remaining passengers. They looked less like silhouettes and more like people again, their features softening into clearer expression. The man with the newspaper moon had his eyes closed now, the folded paper tucked into his coat pocket with care. Mrs. Finch held her basket steady, her chin tucked into her scarf, her expression calm, as if she had made peace with the hour. The young man in the soldier's coat sat quietly, gaze lowered, his cap still in his hands, as if he were letting the lullaby's memory do its work in silence. Even the conductor, standing near the front with his familiar poise, looked different under the changing shade, less like a figure in amber light and more like a man beginning his own morning. Eleanor felt the shift inside herself as well. Fatigue remained, but it had softened into something more manageable, less sharp at the edges. It was still heavy, yet it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like the honest weight of a night lived through. Her shoulders, once stiff with the habit of readiness, rested more naturally. Her hands lay open in her lap, and when she flexed her fingers, she felt the faint edge of her punched ticket still tucked in her glove. It was a small thing, but it seemed to anchor her to the fact that she was on her way, that she had moved through the night and was still moving. The bus traveled through neighborhoods that now looked less like a dream and more like a world preparing to wake. A bakery window glowed faintly with early activity behind its curtains. A milk cart stood at the curb like a quiet promise. A single man walked briskly through the fog, his outline sharpening slightly as the light grew. These were not dramatic signs of morning, but they were enough to change the atmosphere. The city felt as if it were stirring under its blankets, not eager to rise, but willing. Eleanor's thoughts turned toward home with a new tenderness. Earlier, home had felt like a place she might collapse into, a destination defined by exhaustion. Now it felt like a place where she could arrive with a little more gentleness, as if she were not merely retreating from the night, but returning to herself. She pictured the narrow stairwell of her building, the familiar creak of a step near the second landing, the dim light that always seemed slightly too weak. She pictured her small kitchen, the kettle, the cup she liked best. She pictured the simple act of washing her hands in her own basin, water warm, soap ordinary, no one waiting for her to hurry. The images were so quiet they almost seemed like prayers. The bus turned, and the changing light revealed more of the street. The fog was still present, but it had begun to glow softly, rather than merely obscure. It looked almost like cloth lit from within, pale and luminous. Eleanor thought again of Maud's words. Cloth remembers. She understood now that memory did not have to be heavy. It could be something carried gently, like a folded coat or a basket of sweets. The night she had endured in the hospital would remain in her body, yes, but it could be held with respect rather than resentment. It could be honored as part of her life's weave. A faint sound rose from the front of the bus, perhaps the driver adjusting a lever, perhaps the conductor clearing his throat. The small noises of a working morning. Eleanor listened and found them comforting. They reminded her that work continued, yes, but so did rhythm. So did routine. So did the steady forward motion of things that held people's lives together in unseen ways. The bus, like the hospital, was part of that invisible fabric. Yet unlike the hospital, it carried no alarms, no urgent calls. It carried only passage. Eleanor realized she had been gathering small comforts all night, the way a person gathers stones on a walk. Not to hoard them, but to feel their weight and texture, to know they existed. Mrs. Finch's suite had reminded her that nourishment could be offered without shame. The young man's lullaby had reminded her that she had once been soothed and could be soothed again. The man with the newspaper had reminded her that gentleness could be practiced even toward the disposable. The conductor had reminded her that attention could be routine and that being seen mattered. None of these things changed her circumstances. She would still return to the hospital. She would still work nights. Yet they changed something subtle, her sense of herself within those circumstances. As the light strengthened, Eleanor saw that the bus's interior looked different. The worn upholstery, once hidden in shadow, revealed its texture. The brass rails caught a softer sheen. Dust motes drifted briefly in a beam of pale light near the front window, floating as if the bus were filled with slow glitter. The sight made Eleanor's chest tighten gently. Even dust could look beautiful under the right light, she thought. Even ordinary particles could be made luminous simply by being illuminated. The bus approached another stop. The driver eased it down, and the doors opened. This time, a faint ribbon of morning air entered, different from the night cold. It still carried chill, but it felt cleaner, tinged with the promise of daylight. A man stepped aboard, his coat buttoned high, his cheeks pink, his eyes alert. He carried a small paper bag that smelled faintly of bread. He paid his fare and moved down the aisle quietly, taking a seat. The bus, though still calm, now held a slightly different energy, less like a cradle, more like a corridor leading into the day. Eleanor watched the new passenger and felt no resentment, no impatience. She simply observed him with a calm understanding that everyone had their own morning to enter. The bus was not only for those leaving night shifts, it was for anyone moving through the city's quiet hours, anyone who needed passage. That universality made Eleanor feel less isolated in her own life. She was part of a flow of people, each one enduring in ordinary ways, each one carried by systems and rhythms that rarely received gratitude. The conductor moved down the aisle again, checking tickets, greeting familiar faces. Eleanor listened to him speak names in that steady tone, and she felt again the quiet magic of it. Names were such small sounds, yet they anchored a person in the world. Eleanor thought of her own name again, and she said it silently in her mind, as if practicing. Eleanor Hart. The words felt simple, sturdy. They belonged to her beyond her uniform, beyond her fatigue. She did not need anyone else to speak them for them to be real. Still, she imagined how it would feel to hear them said gently by someone who saw her as more than a role. The thought did not make her sad. It made her hopeful in a modest way. As the bus rolled onward, the fog continued to thin. The outlines of buildings sharpened. The sky, still mostly gray, carried a faint lightness near the horizon, like the underside of a shell. Eleanor watched it and felt her mind soften further. She did not feel anxious about what awaited her at home. She felt prepared to enter quiet, prepared to rest, prepared to allow her body to be tended, if only by her own hands. She shifted slightly and looked around the bus one more time, taking in the remaining passengers with a calm affection that surprised her. They were strangers, and yet they had shared something real. The hush of the night, the steady movement, the small exchanges that stitched dignity into ordinary endurance. Eleanor felt grateful without needing to make it grand. Gratitude, she realized, could be quiet. It could be as simple as noticing. The first true ribbon of morning appeared not as color, but as clarity. The fog brightened, and the lamp's halos seemed less necessary. The world began to look like itself again. Eleanor watched this gentle unveiling and felt something similar happening inside her. She was still tired, but she was also more present. She was still weary, but she remembered she was more than that weariness. The bus carried her onward through the last soft minutes of night, and Eleanor let herself be carried toward the morning with a steadier heart, holding the night's kindness like a lantern inside her chest. By the time the bus began its last long stretch, the fog had changed from a heavy curtain into something finer, like gauze. It still drifted across the streets and gathered in quiet corners, but it no longer swallowed the city whole. The The lamps looked less like stars now, and more like ordinary fixtures waiting to be switched off by daylight. The sky behind the rooftops had taken on a pale, steady brightness, not yet blue, not yet warm, but unmistakably morning. Eleanor watched this gradual shift with the calm attention of someone who had spent years observing small changes in breathing and color, learning that life often altered itself gently rather than with drama. The bus's windows held fewer beads of condensation. The glass looked clearer, as if the vehicle itself were waking. Inside, the warm hush remained, but it had a different quality now. It was no longer the hush of deep night. It was the hush of early day, when voices have not yet fully risen and the world is still stretching its limbs. The remaining passengers sat quietly. Their posture subtly changed. People began to straighten, to gather their belongings more deliberately, to glance toward the front as if measuring the distance to their own stops. Mrs. Finch adjusted the cloth over her basket and patted it once, as if making sure the sweetness inside was still safe for her sister. The young man in the soldier's coat slipped his cap on and then removed it again, as if unsure whether he was ready to be fully present in daylight. The man with the newspaper moon opened his paper once more, but only briefly, as though confirming the weather section before folding it away with the same careful gentleness. The conductor remained steady at the front, his posture unhurried, as if morning did not demand a change in his manner. Eleanor felt the bus's rhythm beneath her, like a familiar lull. She realized she was nearing the end of her own passage. For a strange moment, that thought brought a faint reluctance. The bus had become a kind of moving sanctuary, a corridor of warmth and human attention. It had held her without demanding anything from her in return. It had shown her, through small exchanges, that care could be offered in ordinary ways, that dignity could be maintained without performance. Leaving it meant returning to a world where time moved faster, where tasks waited, where her own needs might again become invisible. Yet Eleanor also felt something else beneath the reluctance: readiness. Not the braced readiness she carried into a ward, but a gentler readiness to step into her own life. The bus turned into a street Eleanor recognized even through the thinning fog. The buildings here were modest, their brickwork familiar, their doorways close together. A few windows showed faint light within, suggesting early risers preparing for work. Somewhere, the smell of coal smoke drifted through a crack in the bus's vent, mingling with the clean scent of morning damp. Eleanor's chest tightened with recognition of home territory. She was not far now. The bus slowed and stopped at a final stretch of stops, those small pauses where a few passengers would step down and then the bus would continue again. Mrs. Finch rose when the conductor called her name softly, his voice the same steady tone he had used all night. She moved down the aisle with her basket held carefully in both hands, as if carrying something fragile and precious. When she reached Eleanor's row, she paused and gave her a warm look that carried no sentimentality, only plain kindness. "Mind yourself," she said quietly. "Don't forget you count too." Then she stepped down into the cool morning air and disappeared into the lightening fog, her basket a small promise carried toward someone who needed it. The young man in the soldier's coat remained seated for a few moments longer, then stood as the bus approached another stop. He adjusted his collar, held his cap for a second as if weighing whether to wear it, then set it firmly on his head. As he passed Eleanor, he hesitated, his gaze meeting hers briefly. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple enough that Eleanor could not be sure what he meant. Thank you for listening, perhaps. Thank you for sharing the lullaby. Thank you for acknowledging him as a person. Eleanor nodded, feeling the quiet reciprocity of it. He stepped off and vanished into morning, like a figure dissolving into daylight. The bus became emptier. The space between passengers widened, and the interior felt larger, like a room after guests have left. The conductor moved down the aisle one last time, checking, glancing, steady and calm. When he reached Eleanor's row, he paused again. She could see him more clearly now in the morning light. A man of middle years with a tidy uniform, a face that held patience not as performance but as habit. He did not look hurried. He did not look tired in a dramatic way. He looked like someone who understood the value of small steadiness. "Nearly there, miss," he said. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice quiet. "Thank you." He nodded, as if thanks were simply part of the route, part of the rhythm. Then, as if he had been turning something over in his mind, he added, "Eleanor, isn't it?" The sound of her name in his mouth made her body still. Eleanor. Not miss, not nurse. Eleanor. The word felt like a gentle bell rung inside her chest. For a moment she could not speak. She did not know how he had learned it. Perhaps he had seen it on a name badge beneath her cape. Perhaps he had overheard someone say it. Perhaps he simply guessed. The method did not matter. What mattered was the sensation of being addressed as herself. "Yes," she said finally, and the answer came out softer than she intended. "Eleanor Hart." The conductor's gaze held hers with calm respect. "Right," he said, as if confirming something important. "Eleanor Hart. All right then." And then he moved on, returning to the front, his steps quiet. The exchange was brief, but it landed in Eleanor like warmth. It was not flattery. It was not intimacy. It was simply recognition, delivered with the same steady routine he used to punch tickets and call stops. Yet it felt profoundly personal. Eleanor realized, in that moment, how hungry she had been for her own name, spoken without demand. It reminded her that she existed beyond her role. It reminded her that she was a person with a history, a body, a private life, a self that deserved to be addressed. The bus rolled onward for the final minutes. Eleanor sat with her hands resting calmly in her lap, her ticket still tucked in her glove, now less like proof of passage and more like a small keepsake. She looked out the window and saw the city in a new light, still gray, still damp, but no longer hidden. The fog was now a soft sheen over the streets. The rooftops were clearer. The sky had brightened into a pale wash that promised blue later. A few people walked briskly, collars up, heads down, beginning their day. The world was waking, and Eleanor felt herself waking too, not into alertness, but into awareness of being alive. When the bus finally approached the last stop, it did so with the same calm it had carried all night. The brakes sighed. The doors breathed open. Eleanor stood carefully, feeling the stiffness in her legs and the weight of her bag. She moved down the aisle without hurry. There was no one behind her pressing. The bus, as always, offered patience. When she reached the door, she paused for a moment, letting the cool morning air meet her face. It felt clean. It felt like a gentle cloth laid over warm skin. She stepped down onto the pavement and stood under a lamp that was now faint in daylight. The bus's warmth remained behind her, but she carried something of it inside. She watched as the conductor closed the doors and the bus moved on, its engine sound fading into the waking city. For a moment, she felt as if she had just left a dream, yet she knew it had been real. A night of small conversations, of ordinary kindness, of being seen. Eleanor adjusted her bag strap and began to walk toward home. Her steps were slow, not from weakness, but from a new willingness to move at her own pace. She felt the ache in her body, and she respected it. She felt the tiredness in her bones, and she did not treat it as an enemy. She thought of Maud's stitches, of Mrs. Finch's sweets, of the young man's lullaby, of the newspaper folded like a moon, of the conductor's steady question. All right? And then his gift of her name. Each memory felt like a small lantern, quiet and warm. As she walked, Eleanor made a silent promise to herself, modest but clear. She would still endure because her work mattered and she had chosen it. But she would also remember that she was not only a vessel for endurance. She was Eleanor Hart. She was worth tending. She was worth being spoken to gently, even by her own mind. She would drink her tea slowly. She would allow herself small comforts without shame. She would practice the same steady kindness toward herself that she offered others. The morning continued to brighten, and the fog thinned further, lifting like a slow curtain. Eleanor reached her building, climbed the familiar steps, and paused at her door with her key in hand. Before she turned it, she took one quiet breath, deep and unforced. She let it fill her lungs, then let it go. In that simple breath was everything the night bus had taught her, that ordinary endurance carries dignity, that being seen matters, and that rest is not a reward, but a right. May your own night soften as gently as fog turning to dawn, and may you be carried quietly and safely into deep, untroubled sleep.